Hey, what's up, Liron here. I have a special process for you today. This is going to be a full portrait painting process where I think I managed to capture the essence of the person. Now, people have asked for the full version, so sit back, maybe brew a cup of coffee. It's going to be a long one. I will mention that if you want to learn how to paint realistic watercolor that read well mostly in black and white, check out the Watercolor Realism course. This is how we keep the lights on here by you purchasing a bunch of courses and books. I want to thank you so much for that. Let's jump into the process. So I'm going to be starting here with very light paint. You'll see throughout this process how a lot of things, and you can hear the birds chirping in the background, a lot of things are done in multiple layers just because I had no choice in order to keep the flow on paper. Ideally, I would have worked more directly, but it's just sometimes a necessity. I'm gonna close it a bit. So I'm starting here by pre-wetting a bunch of areas. And this will help me with establishing some flow as we start dividing this into light and shadow. What I would want, again, ideally to capture is as many details as I can when it comes to especially the periphery. So her hair, that thing on her head, the head kind of a thing, I'm not sure what to call it. And everything in the sides I would ideally capture now because these things have some flow to them. Now, you don't have to paint this way at all, what I'm doing right now. This is what I just kind of went for in the moment. There are plenty of other ways to start portraits that I have done before with great success. Don't look at this as this is how you paint, you start this kind of a portrait. You could actually go a multitude of different ways. What I did do is leave a sliver of light on her nose. You can see it here. And I will come back with a brush in a couple of seconds and kind of blend that in. But my point is anything I want to tie together, sorry for the barking, I am pre-wetting a bit, it and its environment. So that I have something to start with. You can replace all of this with just some spraying water on paper, but then you may end up covering some of the highlights, could cause some issues maybe, not necessarily though. So I'm starting to establish this. All of the left side is in the shadow. Even that highlight is a little darker than the right side. So I'm kind of blocking in a shadow for the left side while being a little careful there with the nose area. Now you'll notice the part of the face that's in the light also has a bit of a shadow around here. So that's something you want to capture as well. These things become in the nose, all of this area. These things are subtle, but when they're not there, you sense it. Now, one more thing. The reason I'm going black and white here is just to make it easier. I do aim for quite an impression that is close to the original. And to make my life a little easier, I'm going with black and white. I am, however, working on a version that will be in color. I can show you just a picture of the sketch right now, but it's going to be a larger version that hopefully will be even better looking and in color. But these things take a bit of mental more than anything preparation to me sometimes. So yeah, now I'm gonna smoothen out just a bit of that. What I've done so far is almost like an underpainting just to establish the softer shadows mainly, because that's gonna be harder to do wet on dry. And while the left side is still a little wet, I go in with some darks. Now it's a little wet. It's not wet enough to do wet in wet, but because the color I'm using is so dark, I could afford just going for it. So I did not deliberately leave it wet. I'm not doing official wet in wet here. I'm just going with very dark paint over an area that the dark paint will still look good in. The lower sections are a little more wet, so I can do some more work with them. One thing that has really changed in my perception of working wet and wet on dry and all of that, it's not as binary as it's either wet and wet or it's wet on dry. There are a lot of in-betweens and there are a lot of nuances in the middle. So one would do well to see the full nuances of that. And the fact that it's not a binary yes or no, wet on wet or wet on dry, it hints at another interesting discovery I made, which is there is a lot of nuance within it. You can break a lot of the so-called rules of when to paint and what the perfect timing is, as long as you are paying attention to what's going on paper. Because what you'll end up doing is breaking a rule, getting some cauliflowers and some, weird effects that you can then control and change and make them look like the thing you want them to look. A lot of it happens in the moment. And if you're hell-bent on your plan, you'll just miss that moment, that perfect timing. So it's not as black and white as one would think. So now I'm starting to place in these details on her head cover. This is really cool. I love that pattern. There's an interesting stitching pattern as well that I'm hinting at. I'm not going to actually capture that. But the thing is, I'm coming back right now with very dark black paint. The paint, by the way, it doesn't really matter. It could be neutral tint, could be Payne's gray, could be sepia, whatever you feel you enjoy painting with, doesn't really matter. But the paper is at a level that is primed for wet and wet, that is with very thick paint, so that the paint will leave an impression, but it will have some blurry edges that hint at a pattern. Now, one thing that a lot of people lose sight of, and that has to do with observation, being carefully observing your reference and what you want to put in there, is the entire left side is very dark. It's very easy to put in these dark marks that are the pattern of the cloth, whatever fabric, and forget about that left side that is just super dark. The larger patterns of light and shadow at the end of the day are those that are going to hint at the shape of the object. And this pattern, the smaller scale pattern, is more of a decoration. So what you'll see me do is slowly pushing the entire left side to be darker, because we want to show that it's a rounded thing around her head that goes from the dark to light. Whatever small pattern that's going to stay and still be visible, that's wonderful. That's our goal. But it's to me, to capture the impression I'm after, it is important to capture the overarching light and shadow pattern. Now, I am being a little lazy starting with her left eye, which is to our right, because that eye is detached from the larger shapes of light and shadow, so I can work on it in isolation. It just felt like putting in some work that is fully in isolation, I can really focus on and really dig deep on. This is, by the way, why I'm doing the larger version too. I really want to focus on those small details. I also have zoomed in on the reference photo so you can better see everything, but the idea here is I'm going to start with the eyebrow and then tie it into all of the lights and shadow shapes that make up the eye. That includes everything around the eye, so these shadows, as we get into the eye sockets, usually it goes darker, and then the shadows on the white of the eye as well are quite important here, and the iris and all the beautiful nuances and details there that I really wanted to capture. You'll notice that her hair casts a shadow that follows the shape of the eyelid. It wraps around it, wraps around the white of the eye, wraps around the lower eyelid, and then twists around the upper cheek. That's a lovely pattern. It's one of those things I really love capturing, and I find myself really being fully zoned in on them when I capture them. One thing I want to discuss throughout this video is capturing the essence of the person you're painting. And I do feel like I managed to do it with this portrait, even though you will see I didn't go as dark as the reference photo. For practical purposes, I kept this one a little higher key. For the more detailed one, I'll probably go in more detail, but in more correct values as well. I kept things a little lighter here. But what I do think I managed to do is capture the essence of the person, and I still am not sure how this is done. You could look at it very pragmatically and just talk about the accuracy of shapes, accuracy of values, accuracy of all the transitions, but there's something else to it where you can capture almost the ethereal quality of the person. That is more of your choice specifically to watercolor. That is more of your choice of where to let the color flow, where to let it be more stiff, where to control it more, where to kind of let it do its thing more freely. And it's a thing that's very hard to capture if you're not fully engaged with the process. And doing these kinds of long videos, we're like 10 minutes in, right? And we're barely, there's a way to go. It's not for everyone, this kind of a video, but if you are interested in hearing my thoughts on capturing the essence of a person, it almost requires a bit of more exploration. That's the thing that I discovered. It's all about exploration. It's all about really digging deep into your personal way of painting, your personal connection with the reference photo, which whether you took the picture or not, you still have a connection to it, some kind of a connection, right? You liked something about it. And that's where I'm going to say, you know, be as selfish as you want, quote unquote, and paint only the things you care about. Don't even bother with something that you saw someone else paint and it looks cool as a painting and you're like, I'm going to try it too. If it doesn't interest you, don't even bother. It's, you know, life's too short to paint things you're not fully interested in. And to me, it's going to change. You know, sometimes I have big interest in cars. I'm going to try and make this video as talkative as I can so that you can kind of sometimes zone out, do whatever you're doing while watching. But if you're watching the entire process, then kudos to you and thank you so much. But you know, it's gonna ebb and flow for me between different subject matter. You know, sometimes I'm fascinated with cars, sometimes I'm fascinated with portraits. My fascination with portraits usually goes to really wanting to capture the essence of the person and it being a big challenge. So whenever, just like my first steps into watercolor painting, that challenge of it being so elusive. How do I control or let the medium do its thing? How can I do that? That was the biggest challenge, and that challenge captivated me and wanted me to go deeper and deeper on the medium. In the same sense, portraits really captivate me. And sometimes I'll get caught up on a specific face and really want to capture it. And this is one of those instances. Now, what you saw me do, very practically speaking, is I covered the entire part of the white of the eye, the entire ball of the eye, really, that's in the shadow. I covered it up, and then you see some cast shadows by the hairs. And then within that, I can start establishing the iris, the pupil, all of the nuances within. Now, I do hope with the larger version to capture even more of the nuances there, because you see some awesome reflections in the everywhere there. You can almost see the eyelashes reflected in it. You can see a window reflected in it. It's so cool. But for this size of a painting, it's relatively small. I think it's like a 9 by 11 inches maybe. Yeah, something like that. You can't capture too much of the detail. You can, but practically it's not as fun for me, I guess. So I'm just capturing the essence of the whole thing. And look at how, just like they say, a lot of things, at the end of the day, painting is not necessarily about painting. It's not necessarily about what you do on paper. It's more of you and what drives you to create. And I discovered my own switches over the years. I've discovered what makes me produce a great painting. And that ability to allow myself this full attention on her left eye, knowing that I want to start from there and not from the more involved right side of the face, which is to our left, but rather here, which allows me that full engagement. That's the kind of thing that grows and matures with time. The ability to know yourself and your own mental switches, what actually drives you to paint. And to me, I knew that starting with this eye, it wasn't a practical matter of, this is the more effective way to paint the face. It was a practical matter in the sense of this is the most effective way for me to be driven to capture it. And then later on, you can start with the larger, more involved parts. And this also shows you that even in such a complex, detailed subject matter, you can still start small and slowly build it up. A lot of people are scared that everything has to be connected to everything, that once you start a wash, you need to know exactly what you're going to paint, exactly where you're going to paint it. It's a nice practical idea, but in the true practicality of real life painting, it won't always hold water. So that's something to note, because I have heard people like Joseph Z talk about that in his one of his DVDs. When you start a wash, you need to know exactly what you're going to paint, exactly what you're going to cover, exactly how you're going to paint it. He's no doubt experienced, he built his own way of doing things, but it doesn't always work that way to me, and I don't think it will work that way to everyone. So this is why it's a bit dangerous to take advice on faith. Don't believe anyone, explore. Maybe you discover that it does work for you. Maybe you discover, however, that you do things a little differently, and that is perfectly fine. Whenever I try and watch other painters, what I'm usually taking from it is more of the inspiration to aspire for greatness in my work. So if someone's painting in a way that I consider great, that's the thing I'll take more than anything else. So we zoomed out, the paper is fully dry, and I'm gonna start establishing that tough wash. That wash that covers the entire left side of the face that made me so attracted to painting this portrait. I love when there are interesting shapes of shadow that are large, that are very well defined. It happens to be that here we have quite the complex shapes because there's a large one and it includes the eye in it. And one thing to know, again, on the more psychological level is how can I personally deal with this complexity? What's the best way for me, the best way I personally handle these kinds of complexities in a successful manner? That's experience, you can't really, you won't always know, and in the beginning you won't know, but you get started and you see what happens on paper. That's basically how I approach it with unfamiliar references, unfamiliar scenes. That's usually how I do it. So one thing that is, to me, important is connecting the eye, the part of the eye that's in the shadow, with this large shadow to the left. I do also care about the edges. So I want to make sure that transition on the forehead is smooth. I want to make sure the transition on the cheek is smooth, but I want to make sure that the transitions that are more defined are heart-shaped. Now, you will see me maybe a bit, I don't remember if it happens here, trying to bite more than I can chew, as they say. I don't know, I'm not sure how the saying goes, but you will see me trying to do a lot of things simultaneously. One thing I did comment on recently is hot press paper. This is done on hot press paper. Okay, if you're curious about my supplies, hot press paper brush is a Michael Soloviev brush from his set. This kind of paper, what I found is, at first I had trouble with it, first couple of years ago. I wasn't really successful with getting smooth shapes and smooth washes. Now that I learned how to use it as a tool, I find that it's sometimes easier to produce smoother washes on this kind of paper rather than cold press. Now, what I will say is if you've never tried it, I recommend you experiment and try it, because you may discover that it works for you, just like it worked for me. The big advantage of hot press paper is that there's no texture. So when you scan it, you get a cleaner scan. It's a look that you may find appeals more to you. And a lot of people have gotten used to the watercolor paper texture. There's nothing wrong with that texture. I love it. It helps to create certain effects, but I think there's something to that smooth texture that a lot of people just aren't aware of. They don't know how it fits in their overall creativity. They may find they like it. That's the thing. So now I'm slowly carving that shape of that big shadow. Again, this is a big involved shape. I'm starting relatively light here. I'm not going a la prima crazy dark because I want to make sure that I'm actually capturing the entirety of the shape. The thing is, once you define it initially, like I have here, for the next watch, you'll know exactly where it is, and you'll have a bit more of an understanding where to place the light and shadow, and you'll be able to paint faster and maintain the flow. With that said, some people like to build things up in multiple washes. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, I had a bit of a confusion around the neck area. It's a bit confusing. It's all dark, right? It's all dark, but then there are nuances. In the larger version, I'm actually noticing more of them and how the muscles of the neck inform the light and shadow and all of that. That actually is a thing that happens. When you better understand the shape of these muscles and parts of the body, it is easier to capture because you'll notice them more. What I'm saying basically is, even though you may not have all the experience right now, you can still create something wonderful. And that's exactly how you will build this familiarity and experience with the human body and the portrait, the face, how they're structured. These things do help. These things definitely helped me. And I'm still not fully familiar with the shape of the face and the different planes and how they react to different light and shadow conditions. It's still something I'm learning, but it does help. And when I say help, you just notice things more. So this is pretty much the first wash where I'm just telling myself, okay, here's the light, here's the shadow for the most part. There are some lighter shapes of light and shadow. You'll see me kind of putting those in now. Everything above the bridge of the nose, or the top of the nose there, goes up to the forehead, it's darker. There's also a few stronger shadows on her left side of the face to our right. The part that's in the light essentially still has a bunch of shadows there. That's something, to me, it's very nuanced and still challenging to capture, for sure. It's those things there. It's this small nuance between the very, very light and the very light and the light and the mid value, and also the nuances between the darks and the very darks and the very, very darks. You know, I'm naming them, but imagine everything that is not just a middle, dark, light. Everything in the nuances there. To me, I still find very challenging. I think not only mixing the exact amount, which I think I'm getting there, like I'm talking nuances, the nuances between an 8 and a 9 out of 10, right? It's a small 10% increment. But also seeing. Seeing is where it starts. And if you aren't seeing it accurately, forget about mixing it accurately. You won't be able to still capture it. If anything, I learned that the quality of your perception influences the quality of the art more than other things. This is why if you're good in one medium, you can become very good at a different medium faster, because you have the visual perception. When you don't have any of it at first, you just paint, you build it up, you look at things, right? You look at them, you observe them. You can grow that quality of perception very fast. Now, I want to talk a bit about what's going on paper. So I started establishing this shadow, and as I like to do, I often go straight for the darks. When I start wetting an area, I like to start charging in darker paint. It went a little kind of wild there and out of hand. So I reeled it in by lifting a bit, and now I'm continuing it. So what you'll have right now is a border, a sharp border between the bottom. Now I need to continue this dark wash below the eyebrow. The way I'm going to do it is just come back with wet paint, but I'll have to do it carefully because I don't want the eyebrow to move too much down into the rest of the face. And this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I say fully engaged with the process, noticing what's going on paper. Noticing if the thing you're placing on paper actually looks like, forget about accurate, looks like what you had planned in mind. That's the number one thing I've been seeing over the years with my students is they're thinking they're placing something on paper where it's a different thing. Now, it's okay that you're still not experienced enough to mix the right thing you wanted to mix. The problem is that you place it on paper and you don't notice that. So if you were to notice it, even if you mix the wrong mixture, you can still fix it. And you'll be very perceptive to notice, oh, this is way too light, I'm going to mix a darker paint. That's where the problems begin. Not in the technical ability to mix the right value, but in the actually looking at what's going on paper. And people seem to paint with their attention going elsewhere. The attention goes in different directions. And that is fine, that's natural. That's part of it. You learn to direct it in a more effective manner. So you see I'm building up the eyebrow, right? And you'll notice the eyebrow itself has nuances in it. There are lighter sections, there are darker sections. I'm trying to capture it. Now here is where I think I made a strategic mistake in starting to establish the eye. What I should have, is continue to wash down, cover everything that should be darker, and just focus on the fluidity. What I decided to do instead was start establishing some darks. Now, what this means is I have a wash that is drying on me fairly fast because it's a darker wash, and I have the eye requiring my attention. That is a very difficult thing for me to do as of now. So I'm some kind of skipping the eye. I decide, okay, I'm going to continue downwards, but then I'm going to revisit it in a couple of minutes, and you'll see. But the fact that I didn't just go over it, cover the whole thing up where necessary, aka only left what needs to be as light as it currently is, came to bite me later, because you see, it felt detached. So now I have to come back and fill it in. And I have that wash drying down below. So my attention is effectively split, and you'll notice I'm working really, really fast. Now, I still was able to get a more than decent result there in the eye, but the overall flow of that wash is, there's beginning to be cracks in the armor, so to speak. So it's really a question of, again, knowing what you're capable of at the moment, realizing it live as it happens, as it unfolds, and painting accordingly. Whenever your attention is directed elsewhere, it's very hard to do. Now, I thought I went too dark. Later on, we'll discover I didn't, but I'm trying to make sure it isn't too dark, and I'm kind of equalizing it with the rest of the layer. I'm doing a bunch of things here that, honestly, if I just verbalize them, it won't really do much for you. If there's one thing to take from this stage of the painting, is notice how much I'm living there in the painting. I'm looking at what's going on paper and doing things accordingly. Because that's the one thing I see very few people do. Now, here's where hot press paper shines. Look at the nose. You see how there's a hard edge between that shadowy part and then below it. It goes a little lighter. Look at that hard edge, and you'll see it melt away. That is a property of hot press paper that I've noticed. So again, look at the nose in particular. Look at this hard edge, and as I revisit it with the brush, look at how it loosens up. And it's going to loosen up even more. That's a quality of hot press paper that is hard to achieve in cold press, from what I noticed. Because the paint almost stays more on the surface, it gives you more time to play with it. You can do a lot with it. I'm just scratching the surface with hot press paper of what it's capable of, stretching its abilities. I'm just getting started. And it's an entirely new world, so to speak, to me. Now, as we get to the lips, you notice me hesitating and not covering them, because now I'm thinking, okay, I want to start pushing them to be darker. The way of working, I'm going to go back to the eyes now. The way of working in very thin, multiple washes does not inspire me as much, personally. That's just how I'm built. I don't have as much fun when every wash is just another thin addition, and every time I skip the highlights. Me personally, I don't like that process. A lot of people do. I don't. And that's not a good thing. Again, that's not me being correct and others being incorrect. It has nothing to do with that. It's a very personal thing. And that sometimes hurts my ability to paint these thin washes, because it's just not inspiring to me. And then I end up trying again to chew more than I can swallow, and it ends up being trouble. So now you see there's the bottom drying, and I'm taking a bit more time to focus on the eye. Now this eye has a lot of interesting details to it. All of the middle section there, you see a lot of the eyelashes just casting these sharp diagonal shadows, and that's one of the things I knew for sure I have to capture. Notice how I'm doing a good job with small areas that have a lot of small details in them, but I'm having more trouble with larger washes that have smoother transitions and nuanced transitions. That's where I'm at right now with my watercolor journey. That's the thing where I look at other artists in awe and wonder how they're able to capture these kinds of things. I look at artists like Misselbu and other artists that work a lot of portraits, and I just wonder to myself how they're able to capture all of this nuance in smooth shapes. That's my biggest weakness, I think, right now, even more than colors. My colors are getting better and better. So portraits really put me face to face, pun intended, I suppose, with this challenge and capturing that. So if you're, painting these large areas with smooth transitions and you're getting lost in the sauce, it's not just you. A lot of people experience this, myself included. I do like how cars, even though they have a lot of large shapes, sometimes do them with smooth, nuanced transitions, they still work better for me. I guess because the pattern's a little different, it's a little easier for me to capture. Um, Whereas here you have like the eyes. It's when you think about it in more abstract terms, this is something I sometimes do. Forget about what we're painting for a second, look at its essence. The essence is there are some big shapes, and then within them there are small consolidated areas with a lot of darker details. Cars have that too, but I think not as much, not as involved as the eyes, the nostrils, the lips. It's more of a large shape of shadow, and within it a few minor details. Now it could be my bias because the human face has more details in it. It's more recognizable to us, sorry, not more details, so it's easy for me to spot mistakes. It could be that, I'm not sure. But it's interesting to think why certain problems don't seem to appear when painting one type of subject matter, and they do appear when painting a different type of subject matter. This is something I'm thinking about constantly. I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but there is something cool to, okay, if I'm so good at painting cars directly and they look awesome and I capture all of the nuances really well, what's different about a portrait, right? And people will say a portrait is the hardest thing to paint. It's the thing we're most familiar with as people. It could be that when I personally paint a portrait, it is more important for me to capture the likeness of the person. Whereas with the car, I capture something that's more vague and it still works. It could be many things. It could be many different things. Not sure what they are yet, so we're exploring together. It could be that my freedom and more of a lack of attachment when I paint cars as opposed to portraits is what allows me to be as accurate. And if I had that same thing with a portrait, it would allow me to do that too. It's probably a bit of everything, you know. But yeah, so if I do have this big area there to the right, I am trying to already push it to be as dark as it can. For practical purposes, it's still wet, and then I can merge that with the neck and the details of the neck. I can't explain each and every single choice I make and why I make it. Some of it is a little random, but I felt like connecting it there. And I also felt like stopping where the highlight is. That was a good stop point, so I don't have to now stretch it all the way to the left and cover another large area that's going to be a challenge. Also, this area with the eye really bugged me because it should be darker compared to the rest, so I'm kind of establishing that now. Everything, by the way, on the left side will be darker. It's just, I'm working at it. And in the final wash, it still won't be as dark as it needs to be because, again, I told you I went for a bit more of a high-key effect there. But what I did notice is that all of this shadow to the side of the nose needs to be stronger. Now, one thing I learned personally about how I paint is whenever I try to paint the shadow on the nose, I tend to mess up the smooth edge, and let me explain how. I tend to let it flow too much into the light area. So that's something I've become very well aware of, and I'm trying not to have happen here, which is why you see me still keeping a relatively strong edge there that I will blend in a bit into the light section, but just a bit. And you know, if you talk about introducing paint here, like colors, not just black and white, man, it's a whole different challenge. Because then you start getting into the nuances of paint. What's the paint in the shadow? What's the paint in the mid-shadow? What's the paint in the light? So you see, I'm blending that edge, but the way I'm doing it is very carefully and very conservatively, I would say. I don't want it to move too much into the light. Now, one thing I did learn is you can put the shadow in and then blend out its edges so you don't have to merge it with the rest of the wash. You can paint every area in isolation if you want, if you smoothen out its edges. I'm not going to do it here, but just letting you know, or maybe I am doing it here, I don't remember. But if you have an area that needs darkening, but it's full of smooth transitions around it, you can just put the paint and smoothen out all the edges. Or you can pre-wet and put it wet and wet if you're more of a risk taker like me. But you don't have to do what I'm doing now, of adding a dark shadow, merging it with a larger overall wash. You don't have to do it. You can work in small additions. And you will see artists doing that with watercolor. Working small additions, making them wet so that they're smooth. Small additions, wet, smooth. I think the taste I've acquired for how I want my paintings to look like is that which I don't like a lot of fragmented shapes. I do want some smoothness there. So I'm not going to build it up with lots of small shapes and details, actually. I'm going to try and get it in one wash. That comes with a price you pay, for sure. Now notice how the bottom of the nose is a little lighter than the middle. There's a lighter section there. I'm trying to capture that right now with this wash. So you'll notice how the entire bottom of the nostril is and the bottom of the center of the nose are lighter, and then it becomes darker. That's what you call reflected light. So the entire side of the nose and the bottom is in shadow, but then within that shadow, the lower section of the shadow is a touch lighter. It's an effect that it took me a while to learn to capture, but at some point now I have it pretty much. I notice it more, so it's easier to capture. Now it's time to step things up. I'm gonna continue with this wash. I pre-wet with the smaller brush, coming back with this brush. I'm gonna move this wash, make it darker all of the left side. Now, because I already have that smooth layer from before, I know where to paint. I'm gonna have an easier time. All I have to do is just cover that area with darker paint. Now I do have to be careful because I established some details on the nose there, so I'm working with a gentle, soft hand. There is not enough talk about gentleness. And this portrait, I think this video is titled in my folder, Gentle Black and White Portrait, because there is something to feeling what the brush and paper do when they interact. And no one talks about it because how are you going to explain it, right? I'm very gentle with the brush. But I find when you paint glazes, when you paint layers over an existing wash, when you paint shapes one next to another, it does require being gentle sometimes and for certain results that you're after. And really being aware of how the brush is going to interact with the existing wash. How are you going to put it into a trick or a technique or an advice? It's very challenging, you know. This is why a lot of these watercolor tips and tricks, unless they're extremely practical, usually they don't really do the thing people hope for. People hope to get a trick in their toolbox that they can always take out and use. Usually it's overhyped and the trick itself doesn't justify the hype for it. Let me give you an example for a very practical trick, so to speak. It's that video I did on wet and wet that maybe you've watched, maybe you haven't. When you place a shape, wet and wet, so let's say the paper is wet, you come back with a brush. As long as that brush is moving and touching the paper, the paint is not going to spread out too much. You'll have a bit of control actually, wet and wet, but as soon as you lift it off the paper, you're going to get a blob of paint spreading out. That's a useful trick. That's understanding how the physics of water and paint work. That's useful. But if you're talking about, you know, there's a lot of different so-called tricks that just aren't useful. They don't do much. And they amount to just a little cute, what do you call it, a gimmick that actually in the test of painting won't be useful to you. It's all in the nuances. It's all in the nuances of how you paint, how you enjoy painting, what types of views and subject matter you enjoy painting, what drives you, what makes you notice the details. If a reference doesn't interest you, of course you won't pay attention to all the small nuances and details because you don't care about it. But if you do care about it, you're going to zone in, you're going to be an eagle, you're going to really watch everything. You're going to capture those things that you notice, right? So yeah, on that note, I think I went in a bit of a tirade there. Tirade, is that a word? Whatever. Now notice that part of the face that's strong contrast with the shadow of the whatever, neck, hair, everything, her right to our right. From past experience, I've had so many trouble capturing this line smoothly and cleanly, and it's still not round enough, by the way, I think. So I think I sharpened that corner a bit. I made it too sharp. I should have rounded it up. I don't know if I'll get a chance to fix that, but again, it's one of those things you learn your own shticks and your own common mistakes, but that's fine. Now onto the lips. You'll notice I do have a hard edge there. Thanks to it being hot press paper, I can fill in that area in a second and it will kind of smoothen out. But you'll notice that I did finish up all the left side of the face so that I can focus on the lips for a while, because there's a lot of nuances there. What you'll notice is the lips appear dry, just naturally. There's, if you really zoom in on the reference photo, and I have shared a link below, I did also have the sketch below, I forgot to mention. You will notice that you can see the different creases and folds in it. That's just natural, that's how it is. And all of these create some very interesting shapes of light and shadow, both in the lower and upper lip. It's easier to notice in the lower lip with these vertical lines. You'll see me putting it in a second, but it also happens in the upper lip. Now, it's a question of, do you enjoy showing these things? And if you don't have to show them. You can idealize and simplify some of them so that it's not so prominent. I am taking a middle ground approach here. I do want to show some of it, but I don't want to show too much of it that it's distracting. So you do see a bit of these vertical lines. You will see more of them later on as we add more details to the lips. That's usually how I do it. It's, my impression is kind of in the middle, I would say. Now, the stage we're at with this painting is, to me, it looks beautiful. I think it already captures some of the essence of the person. We are missing on the lid side, we're missing a bit of nuance there to make the cheeks look fuller, to make the side of the face look more interesting. And on the shadowy side, we do need to get it a touch darker still. There are some nuances, I'm still putting in the lips and these sorts of details, but for the most part, what it needs is just to be darker overall. And that's the kind of thing where this is not an ugly stage of the painting anymore, what you define an ugly stage. But it is applicable to this stage and the ugly stages. People get stuck. They had a vision, the thing does not match it, and it's okay. That is fine. That's just how a painting is built. Here are those vertical lines I talked about. I take a middle ground approach. It's not too prominent. I indicate some of them, but very briefly. And it's okay to be at a stage where things don't look like you want. Sometimes you won't be inspired. That happens to me. Sometimes I'll look at a painting and I'm like, it's too far gone. I won't continue it, I'll start anew. But very often it is a case of just continuing to push it towards completion. And here you get to see a stage that it's not the ugly stage, but still there's a big gap between where we are and where I want us to be. Now, the thing that inspires me to continue with this one is the eyes are there. The eyes, they're cut. They look good. The lips too, I would say. The nose maybe could use some work, but the thing that's missing here really is the big shadows. So that's not a big deal. And to me, that's inspiring. This is why sometimes I tell you, it's very personal, but sometimes I'll go first for the small details that make it kind of the wow effect. Because that inspires me to then keep going. Sometimes I'll go straight to the focal point. Sometimes I like to save it for later and kind of establish the more general shapes. But very often I'll go straight for the focal points, the parts that I find most nuanced, most interesting. Sometimes to the detriment of the painting because it's impractical to start there. But what's practicality? The most practical thing you can do is work in a way that inspires you. So I think I have a bit of a beard hair there. So, the most practical thing is to work in a way that inspires you, which is why I often treat this as just pure play and go for the thing that interests me the most. So now I'm starting to establish these darks on the hair, and I'm going to move those into the shadowy part of the face as well that needs darkening. Right now the contrast is not strong enough. There's not enough of a feeling of volume because of it. This is the optimization stage. There's a lot going on here, but once the bulk of the painting is established, you can really kind of relax a bit. You lean back in your chair, even though you're not painting. And really observe it, give it some time, let it almost tell you what it needs. Mostly darks. It's mostly darks. Some details. The left side should be darker. A lot of things should be darker. The left side meaning not just the left side of the face, but also the hair there needs to be darker. The larger version, as I've shown you, hopefully, it's more zoomed out, so you can see a bit more of the hair and the hand holding. There's a hand running through the hair that I really wanted to capture. Now, in terms of darkening, this is simpler because I know exactly where to darken. I will hopefully darken this area as well and the side of the face. You'll see me doing that later on. But it's very simple. It's just, let's darken it. Now, again, when you paint over existing paint, it's hard to explain, but there is a bit of gentleness required. If you rub the brush too much, it can lead to undesired results. Now I'm thinking I went too dark. I didn't. I should have kept that paint, but it's fine. There's this, you see, I'm working over a lot of nuances of light and shadow. I'm just painting over them. I'm, again, pre-wetting. This time I think I wanted to let the paint move more into the light, because the thing is, you look at this, the highlight on the cheek, and you think to yourself, wow, that's as light as the other side of the face. It's not. If you look at what I currently have compared to the photo, there's a lot more darkness on that shadow there, on that highlight. It's more nuanced, there's more, it's one of those things I noticed after the fact. So yeah, I'm not sure what kind of lesson you can learn from it, but things are quite elusive. Things are quite confusing. Like this little shadow I just put in, I did want to show a bit of reflected light on the very edge of the face, even though it's not there. Or maybe it is there, I don't know. The cheek looked a little darker. Same for the nose, but look at what happens once I put that in. It's you don't see it enough, so I'm gonna go for a darker paint, and then you're gonna see it too much. It's all like you won't get it right. That's the thing, you won't get it sometimes right. Often the thing you place on paper won't match it. It's not a question of getting the perfect thing down on paper. It's a question of seeing after you place it and then fixing it. Noticing it is the first step if you even want a prayer of fixing it. Some artists are able to get it right the first time. I very much adore that and admire that. Again, Miss Sulbu comes to mind. She's fantastic. I don't know how. The thing that goes on paper is accurate the very first time. I find that incredible. That's the quality I'm kind of striving towards, if I can get it right the first time as much as possible. But notice how just placing in these darks right now that I'm placing and making the left side of the face darker, it gives it more volume, right? So I told you two things, right side and left side. The left side, already it gives it more volume. Just wait until we put in some more shadows to the part that's in the light. It's gonna blow you away. The difference it makes it's crazy. Sometimes, again, it's the things you notice visually. When you notice something, you're able to catch it. It's not about the technical skills, it's about noticing it. Even if the way you capture it is wonky. Let's look at this, what I'm doing right now. I'm strengthening that shadow right next to the nose, and look at how I'm not getting the right consistency on the brush. I'm gonna get paint that is way too strong. I remember this section very well. Look at, just give me a second, you'll see. I'm gonna put paint that's very strong. Even me with, I don't know, I guess about 8 years of watercolor, I still get these details wrong, and then I have to fix them on the fly. If anything, that's the thing I would like to get right the first time. It still eludes me. It really does. If you are a person who can get that right the first time, send me an email and I'll consult with you. The chance of someone like Misulbu seeing this video are low, but you know, if someone like that sees it, I'm actually curious. Actually, I may shoot them an email. We'll see. But yeah, you see, I'm carving it out. I'm starting with something. It doesn't look exactly right. I'm blending it. I'm trying to get it to look right. And I got it, mostly. I got that core shadow and then that reflected light there. And you know, there's not much to say about what I'm doing right now. I can't really teach it in full detail. What I can teach you is to see things. That's, by the way, another thing I do talk about in the Watercolor Realism course that I mentioned at the start of this video. You'll learn to notice the nuances of light and shadow, and in that noticing, you'll make your own path into capturing. The most exciting thing for me is to see a student figuring it out for themselves. When a student notices something they haven't noticed ever, and it was my job to help them notice it, and then they find their own unique solution that I haven't thought of, honestly. That to me is one of the most exciting things. And sometimes it's so simple. And I'll see this in videos sometimes, in tutorials of someone who's truly great, and they paint, and they do something where I would struggle. They found such a graceful solution that I would have never thought of. And sometimes that solution is very individual. It won't work for me, but sometimes it does, you know, and sometimes it plays to their strength, their unique strength of noticing things, of doing things, or, you know, technical strength, something they're good at technically. But sometimes it will be relevant for me too, and I'll be able to make use of it. So it's one of those things that I think most fascinating. The how usually is not the problem. It's in seeing the problem itself that the solution lies. So yeah, so now we're really almost done. It's up to just small improvements. And this is a stage where you can still kind of mess things up. So I'm still working things rather carefully. My plan is to get one last wash that is a little darker there on the left side. It's still too light. Now it's a question of, do I want it to look as dark as the reference photo, or do I just want to push it a little darker to look more natural in the context of the painting that I currently have right now? And that's something big you'll notice. At some point, especially for paintings that inspire you, you'll notice very naturally, and here I'm gonna let the paint move more into the light side, now I remember, with this wet and wet action I just did. Sometimes the painting will veer off from the reference at some point, and then if it really inspires you, you'll make it work in its own context. You'll make the painting work as a painting, not as a replica of what you're painting. Some people find inspiration in replicating, others don't. Totally personal, that's fine. You have artists like Thierry Duval doing crazy, hyper-realistic work that's indiscernible from photo. And you get people like me who prefer a bit more of that. I want to see some of the flow of watercolor. And then you have artists like Misselbu who are perfect in capturing that. That flow they capture is fantastic. You can't mistake it. It is watercolor. You cannot mistake it. What you're looking at is a watercolor painting that captures the subject matter in the most perfect of ways. It's hard to describe, you know. You'll notice, by the way, on the side that's contrasting with the dark, I messed it up, but it's okay. No one will notice. There's a bit of a dot there, that the cheek, where the cheek is, her left cheek to our right. The line, again, I told you it's not perfect. That's fine. So now I'm starting to establish a bit of those shadows I talked about. That's the other half, establishing the shadows in the light side. Something I find quite tricky, I must say. It's one of those things I should have captured with the left side together in one go. It would have been easier. But this is one of those things I still miss. Actually, seeing myself painted now makes me more aware of how often I miss it, and hopefully this was the step needed to not miss it as much. We'll see. Maybe this is a turning point, perhaps. But you'll see it goes around the bridge of the nose, connects to the bottom of the eye, lightens up a bit above the eyebrow. That's usually where the shape of the face points upward. The forehead points forward, and then it goes a little like this. So this area catches more of the light, and you get less of a dark there. So you'll get a very dark eyebrow, and ironically, just above it, a lighter section. that's one of those things. If you study the anatomy of the face, you'll notice. If you don't, you won't, and that's fine. Usually you won't. Now this shadow. This is probably one of the most important shadows I've shown so far. Again, the light side of the face has shadows in it. Very important to capture. Look at how much volume it gave the entire face. It made it look round. And I would, even if I had to leave this as a hard edge, I would put this shadow in because it was that important. But I did manage to smoothen it out, kind of connect it with the shadow there. You know, when you smile, that shadow deepens. But she has kind of a straight face here, so it's not too deep of a thing. Sometimes people make the mistake of capturing this as a single line, which ends up looking like a crease. So it makes the person look older. That's something you want to be very mindful of. It's almost like painting the teeth individually. If you are going to paint the teeth individually, you have to be quite careful doing it because it can be interpreted as almost monstrous in a way. It's one of those things you have to be careful of. I should have, by the way, established a darker even shadow there. Maybe I'll go over it and darken it. I don't remember. I didn't go bold and courageous enough there. Again, one more lesson that, because I don't do a lot of portraits, so now I'm learning everything from watching and rewatching myself paint. I think this is how I was able to improve relatively fast in these, whatever, 8 years of painting. Seeing myself painting and noticing all the things I could have done differently. This, by the way, is very important. This shadow on the side of the lips, again, very important in establishing the muscles of the face. There's a muscle there that pulls the mouth in different directions, and it does add a lot to the likeness. That's the thing. The likeness is influenced by these small details, also by these small details, also by these small details. You see there's a bit of a gentle shadow on both sides under the eye. What I'm doing now is just decorations, small details. It's not as important, admittedly. It did feel like this was a bit too strong, so I wet it a bit and lift it just a touch, not too much. It can make sometimes the cheeks look too puffy. I'm smoothing out that line. I'm going to smoothen out, hopefully, that also this transition. There's a bit of a stronger shadow between the eyebrow and the nose. That diagonal shadow should be smoothened out. I don't remember if I do it. Hopefully I do it. I can look at the final painting and see if I did it. I just don't remember at the moment. But yeah, there's a lot going on. Human face, there's a lot going on. Just capturing it to look like a face requires some understanding. I forgot to loosen that line. And then getting the likeness is another challenge. It's fine. You build experience. When you paint, you build that experience, not in order to build it, but in order to actually notice more things. Solve problems in a very practical manner, right? If you feel lost, if you feel like you're overwhelmed, I can tell you for sure I've been there. For sure I've been overwhelmed by portraits, especially. Final result, again, a lot of imperfection here as well, right? But the more of your quality of understanding of what you paint develops, the more things you'll be able to capture. I hope you enjoyed this demo. I want to thank you so much for watching. I want to remind you again to check out the Watercolor Realism course if you want to be able to capture things that feel realistic. You can check out the frustration-free watercolor course as well if you're a step before that of loosening up, letting go with the medium. And I want to thank everyone who supports me over on Patreon as well. Thank you so much for doing this. If you want to receive credits at the end of the videos, be sure to check that out. I will put a link in the description box below. You get a few perks, a few extra videos there, exclusive processes. There is a post open to everyone. If you want to see the lessons I learned from 8 years of watercolor painting, check that out as well. It's open for everyone. You don't even need to have a Patreon account. You can just hit the link below and see it. I want to thank you so much. We'll see you in the next vid. Take care.